Thanks, John. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the NSP Closeout Program Income webinar. My name is Taylor Edwards. I am a technical assistance provider with ICF, and I'm so glad you've joined us. So before we get into the webinar contents, we'll kind of cover some housekeeping items today, and then we'll hop right in after that. So for the materials, the PowerPoint has been posted for this session. We'll provide the link in the chat box in just a second. Webinar materials are going to be posted on the HUD Exchange in the NSP training section, when you can see on your right side, 7 to 14 days after the live webinar. For presenters today, you have myself again. My name is Taylor Edwards. I'm with ICF. I'm also joined by my colleagues, Oni Ibe and Les Warner from ICF. And then we have the pleasure of having Duncan Yetman from HUD with us today as well. For the agenda today, we'll receive the HUD welcome. Then we'll hop on over to program income overview. We'll then talk about critical decisions as it pertains to program income. We'll have our program income tool, which we'll cover, and then we'll move into a Q&A section. Just as a reminder for you all today, this is one webinar, the second webinar in our NSP Closeout series. Throughout this series, we'll cover updates to HUD requirements that grantees must follow to properly close out their NSP grants, the steps and special considerations grantees must work through to properly dispose of NSP-funded properties in a land bank, possible strategies grantees can use to determine what's the best use of their remaining NSP program income, which we'll be covering today. And then we'll also review new tools and resources to help guide all NSP grantees throughout the closeout process. We encourage everyone to check out all the sessions. So last week we did have our NSP Closeout overview sessions. This covered the updates to the NSP closeout process outlined by the HUD Notice CPD 2214, as well as the steps needed to close out all NSP grants. With the NSP program income closeout portion of this series, we are on our webinar today, but we also encourage folks to join our office hours on July 20th. Throughout this portion of the series, we'll cover strategies to prepare for NSP closeout as it pertains to NSP program income and how to manage and assess the need of NSP program income within an NSP program. Later next week, we will then cover NSP land bank closeout as that webinar and the office hours. And during this portion, we'll learn how to dispose of NSP funded properties in a land bank and monitoring and compliance requirements for land banks post closeout. As you all are here today, we encourage questions to come in throughout the webinar using that Q&A function. These are going to be questions pertaining to program income broadly and NSP program income. However, if you have any specific programmatic questions specific to your program, DRGR, or your closeout status, we do encourage everyone to come to the office hours on July 20th. If you are registered for this webinar, which if you're in here, you are, you will be automatically registered for the office hours, and we encourage folks to attend. We'll be, again, answering those program-specific questions, but we'll also have time to cover any questions that we don't cover today in the Q&A portion. And with that being said, I will pass over the presentation to Duncan Yetman for the HUD welcome. Duncan?
Great, thank you, Taylor. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Duncan Yetman. I'm the Deputy Director of the Entitlement Communities Division in the Office of Block Grant Assistance here at HUD. And I'm very pleased to be able to welcome you to the 2023 NSP Closeout webinar series. HUD is very excited to be offering this webinar series as part of our continuing effort to provide technical assistance to our grantees looking to close out their NSP1, NSP2, and NSP3 grants. Today's session focuses on NSP program income and how grantees should begin to think, if they haven't already, begin to think strategically about this source of funding, this NSP program income, with regard to their greater housing community development and objectives. And you know, the impetus for this series obviously was our closeout notice from last December for the CDBG program. But even before then, we had NSP closeout notices published in the Federal Register, and one in particular from September of 2019 focused on the transfer of NSP program income to your CDBG program, giving grantees with existing entitlement grants or state CDBG grants greater flexibility with regard to the use of those dollars in their housing and community development efforts. So we welcome you to today's session. This will spell out more of the details from that Federal Register notice back in September of 2019. We understand that much of what was maybe published back then was lost on you. You may be new. Over 50% of our grantee staff, we've discovered, is new since 2019 out there in the field. So we encourage you to ask questions, actively participate in today's webinar, and welcome again to our NSP Closeout series. I'm going to pass it over now to Anya Iba from ICF to take you through today's material.
Thanks, Duncan. So welcome, everyone. We're going to have two sections to this. The first section, like Duncan said, we're going to focus on strategy. And then the second piece of this will focus on providing specific case examples that will hopefully elucidate a little bit more of what those strategies are meant to do. And hopefully that will provide you guys with enough information to go forward, either with closeout or how to think about closeout with respect to program income. Please make sure to ask questions and use the Q&A feature. Love to hear what you guys are thinking about and make sure that you guys get the response you need. So to kick things off, this slide here, talking about the program income status, the data here is as of the April end report. As you can see on the chart here, the pie chart, we've had cumulatively across NSP 1, 2, and 3, we had $2 billion of program income that was received. Of that, we've had about 1.88 billion program income dispersed, and roughly about 260 million still remaining as of the PI balance. So clearly, you know, a lot of PI out there that's still being managed. So something that we want to talk through again today is for those of you in the call who do have program income, how do we intend to handle that? And like I said, hopefully today's session really provides you with the tools to do so. All right, so as we start to think about closeout and look at program income, there are things we want to consider. So like the first one would be, is program income preventing you from spending down your line of credit? Are there still properties eligible to be assisted with NSP funding? If applicable, does your CDBG program have a greater need for the program income than NSP? And if NSP program income were to be transferred to CDBG, would it impact how you meet your timeliness requirements? Continuing on, you also want to think about, do you expect there to be program income on hand at the time the closeout agreement is expected to be signed? Do you understand how all the regulations that are currently governing NSP program income will continue to apply to the funding on hand at the time of closeout? And lastly, do you have a strategy to spend down program income versus transferring that program income to CDBG? So when managing the program income and thinking about those considerations, there's a few things that we want to make sure that you guys keep in mind. First one being that activities that are solely funded with program income do not need to be complete or meet a national objective prior to grant closeout, but will eventually need to meet a national objective. Two, because program income must be spent in advance of the grant funding, you may have funds remaining in your NSP line of credit, so just be aware of that. And three, you should make sure that all the program income that has been recorded in DRGR and all the financial information that you've entered into the system is consistent with the same information that can be found within your internal records. So you want to make sure those two things are matching. If there's any discrepancies, do make sure you have a process in your policies to go back and reconcile those discrepancies. Continuing on, you'll also need to be strategic in how you address existing and future program income when doing closeout. 5, you want to do your best to assess the level of remaining need in the NSP programs you currently have and really determine how much program income is remaining and the probability of getting future program income. And then lastly, 6, you want to identify if you should exhaust the program income for NSP or again, transfer it all to CDBG. So those are the things you want to be considering. And then when you're managing program income, these are the things you want to bear in mind as you're, formulating your strategies and thinking about what's the best solution for you guys. So before we get into the strategies, one thing I wanted to talk about is this table, which is pretty key for, I think, the conversation we're having today. This table comes out of the 2014 Closeout Guide. It's on page 32. And it goes over how to treat program income when the amount received exceeds a specific dollar threshold. So there's 3 things you want to just remember here. Just to bear in mind too, this table is actually much larger. It actually splits into specific requirements for states versus non-entitlement. I'm only reflecting the first portion of that table, which is reflective of states. So just be aware. But again, it's on page 32. You can go back and read the details if you want. Okay, 3 things. For income under $25,000 per year that was received, the program income is to be used for general administrative costs. So, should be used for general administrative costs. For program income between 25,000 to just under or to $250,000 per year, the program income should be used for activities that are NSP eligible and will eventually meet a national objective. For program income exceeding $250,000 per year, the program income must meet the 25% set aside requirement. So there's 3 things going on here. As you guys are making your decisions about what to do, just bear in mind that this is going to come into play. All right, so now for the next 5 slides, what we're going to do is we're going to cover 4 strategies that hopefully can help you deal with any program income that's remaining that you have. So to start things off, we're going to talk about the idea of ramping up your overall spending. So this idea comes from the fact that, as we sort of mentioned earlier, program income must be spent before drawing down funds from your main grant or your line of credit. So any remaining program income will typically prevent you from spending down the remaining grant balance, right? So the first strategy here is going to be relevant if there is both existing grant funds and program income and your NSP activities have not been completed yet. what we're talking about here is really making sure that you reassess your existing NSP activities and consider if there are some NSP projects or activities that can still be funded. What you're likely going to want to do here is think about, are there ways that we can ramp up our program expenditures to draw down both the grant funds and the program income simultaneously? To dig deeper, you may want to think about, revisiting your program design and making updates. Maybe you want to fund new programs, or maybe you want to conduct additional outreach on the availability of NSP funding in order to sort of eat away at both the grant funding and the PI funding. And, if you were to go through that process and you see, well, we're still not able to really attack this balance, maybe what you have to just do is just consider, again, transferring the funds to CDBG at that point. I would also encourage you guys to work with your local HUD field office as well, if you guys are having challenges on this point, to just try to figure out, is there something programmatically that can be done as well to get things moving? All right. In the case where only program income is remaining, then we need to think about how we spend down NSP program income in preparation for closeout. So again, similar to the first strategy, this is probably going to require looking at your current NSP activities that can be funded, thinking about how you can do more outreach in order to get more participation. One thing that we have developed with regard to this, there's two tools that we'll go over in more detail later, but we've developed two tools, the Program Income Tracker and the NSP Program Income Checklist. These tools are meant to help you to account for any outstanding program income received or receded, but not yet actually drawn down. So again, it allows you guys to really look at the math, like what is it that we need to address in terms of program income, but also going back to what we talked about earlier with the consideration, the checklist will actually ask you specific questions, that will allow you to really do your investigation and due diligence in order to figure out, okay, what is it that we need to do or what can be done to address that program income. And then, as we mentioned in that table that I pulled from the 2014 closeout guide, any program income spent after closeout should still comply with the 25% set aside requirement if that program income exceeds the 250,000 per year. So if you guys are running into that case and you're about to close out, just be mindful of that as you're thinking about, can we actually spend this money before closeout? At least 25 is may play a part in that. So yeah, just be mindful of that. Okay. Now, if we decide to keep the program income post closeout, one thing we want to encourage everyone here is to really coordinate with HUD on your plan for managing that program income and really be specific and clear about what is your timeline for spending down that program income. If you keep the program income at closeout, just remember that the amounts subject to LH25 requirement must be spent within 3 years of the date of the closeout agreement. And then also remember, if NSP program income generated does not exceed that $25,000 per year, the funds can be used for general administration. And again, the 2014 closeout guide has more details on this. So lastly, if we cannot ramp up, or if we don't need to ramp up spending in order to reduce our grant balance or to reduce the balance of PI, or if we intend to keep PI for the NSP program post closeout, if we are not going to use any of those options, the option to consider here is maybe we want to transfer the program income to CDBG entitlement, right? So Now, if you decide to do that, you'll need to submit a request to your local HUD field office and get an approval. For those of you on the call that are familiar with IDIS, you'll use that system to transfer NSP program income that you may have on hand and any future program income to the CDBG program. If you guys need details on this, you can refer to, I think it's on the HUD Exchange, you can refer to Chapter 7 of the online IDIS manual for step-by-steps on how to do this. For those of you on the call who do not have an open CDBG grant at closeout, any program income received for up to 5 years after closeout would only need to be expended for an NSP eligible activity and meet a NSP national objective. And I want to make a note here to clarify that point that I just made. That point that it needs to meet or needs to be expended for an NSP eligible activity and meet an NSP national objective. This is for PI applicable to activities that were funded before closeout. If the program income was for an activity funded after closeout, that income can be used without the typical NSP restrictions. But HUD does encourage you guys to make sure, if you can, they want to encourage that you use it according to the NSP guidelines. Okay. So this slide is just a continuation of the former one on transfers. So for those of you that, do have a CDBG entitlement grant, that are familiar with IDIS, as I said, refer to Chapter 7 of the manual, which should be on the HUD Exchange for more details on that. But this slide really was just meant to cover the quick summary of the steps of what that process would be. Essentially, you would be going into IDIS, clicking Receipt Add on the funding screen to display the Add Receipt menu. You would select the Formula Grant Receipt option for funds from NSP. You would enter the information for the program year of receipt, source type, fund type, the recipient name, and then you'll save and complete. And then once that is done, I believe you should be good on the transfer at that point. So again, the 4 steps here, we can ramp up our spending, we can draw the PI before closeout, we can keep the PI post closeout, or we can choose to transfer that PI to CDBG. All right. So the next slides, I'm going to pass it now to my colleague, Les Warner, to go through specific scenarios that will highlight these strategies and hopefully give a little bit more detail. And I see a lot of questions are coming through, so I think we'll have a pretty robust conversation on some of the questions you guys are asking. So now I will pass it over to Les.
Great, thanks, Anya. So what we want to do is pretty much we're going to go back through what Anya kind of walked us through, but try to think about this in terms of scenarios that you may be experiencing. And you'll see that a lot of what we're talking about here is a need for you to kind of go through a sort of comprehensive look at, what are my options here? Where do I have the most demand? Is it NSP? Is it in my CDBG program? Thinking about capacity to try to make the best decision for not only being able to make the best use of the funds, but also working within the capacity of you and the partners that you have available for you. So when we talked about this ramping up of overall spending, so Anya talked about the fact because we have this rule that program income has to be expended prior to being able to draw down additional funds from your line of credit, we probably have some folks that are kind of churning, trying to get to spending down that final amount of money in their NSP line of credit. But because of that stream of program income coming in, whether it's in very regular amounts or whether it's sort of unexpectedly coming through, is that's really preventing them from being able to get out of that category and of still having money in their line of credit. And so if you're finding yourself in that category, then you're having to think about, can I actually put together a large enough program to be able to not only handle all program income that's coming in, because we have to expend that first, but in addition to that, have enough demand for our program to be able to expend those the final amount that's left in our NSP line of credit. So in this case, what we're suggesting that Garden City would need to do would be to do an analysis of what's that total amount of funding between not only program income that we have on hand, but what's our projected stream of program income coming in the door on this, along with what we still have remaining in that line of credit, and then to take with that amount, then be looking at not only your own capacity, but also looking at eligible projects. Now, I would think for a lot of folks, and Duncan mentioned the kind of stunning statistics of the number of folks that weren't actually in this position when the NSP program began. And so for a lot of you, you weren't part of figuring out where's the demand for this, how do we market this best. And for a lot of NSP programs, they went through a couple of iterations on that to try to, as they learned more, to try to change or redesign their program to be able to expend those funds. So it may be time to do that same sort of analysis that was done on the front end, to think about, where do we have opportunities? Have we designed our NSP programs really narrowly, and are there other eligible activities or other areas where we might be able to use our NSP funds, not only our line of credit but also our program income, to be able to do that? So there might be some changes to the design of our program as part of that. Also thinking about, in a lot of communities, there was a lot of marketing, there was a lot of working with partners in the early days of the NSP program, explaining what the program allowed, what the restrictions were on this, and trying to identify where there were eligible projects. But much like turnover of grantee staff, we also have really high levels of turnover in some of these other organizations and other potential community partners on this. So I think it may be also time to go back and revisit and have a discussion with some of those other potential partners, looking for potentially eligible properties that could be assisted, making sure that those other community partners are actually familiar with what's allowable under NSP and how could these funds be utilized, to try to determine if there's some extra demand that maybe you're currently not being able to tap into. And so the goal here is to be able to build a larger footprint for your NSP program, to be able to spend down any program income that's coming into the door, in addition to whatever existing line of credit is still remaining. So that analysis of what's my total dollar that I need to spend down, looking at my program design, and then I think remarketing in the goal of identifying an adequate pool of projects that could be undertaken. And so that's what we're talking about. We're talking about ramping up the program so that you have the ability to be able to spend down both the program income and those remaining funds in your line of credit. Anya also talked about, under scenario 2, that the NSP grantee may have the goal of, let's just get these funds spent. So in this case, Promise County, they have managed to clear out, to expend their line of credit, but they still have a remaining program income balance of $450,000. So a pretty significant amount of funding. And in doing this sort of comprehensive look on thinking about where would these funds be best utilized, they pondered about the potential of maybe moving those funds to their CDBG program. But what they found in looking at their CDBG program was that that program currently was already kind of struggling to stay in compliance with the timeliness requirements. And so adding another $450,000 of NSP program income and transferring that to the CDBG program is going to further exacerbate that situation. And so in this case, the determination is that's not a good option for us to transfer that to the CDBG program. And so in this case, Promise County needs to then figure out how do we make sure that we're able to expend the program income prior to closing. And so in this case, again, the same sort of thing of looking at those local programs and determining whether there is enough demand for this. And again, that might be also looking at the program design. And in many cases, folks were very targeted with their original uses of NSP. If you've already then addressed those more specific targets, it might be time to look and see, could we expand those service areas that we were targeting? Or maybe the demographics have changed and we actually see eligible projects in other areas where at the time the original targeting was done, those weren't particularly good targets for the NSP program. So going back through that reevaluation of the local market, also identifying not only past partners, but are there other new partners that you could work with in being able to facilitate the use of these NSP funds, program income in this case, to meet those needs that are designated for the NSP program. And so again, that thought of going back to those partners, making sure we're current on that communication, thinking about remarketing that program to make sure that folks know the funds are available, how they can be used, and that we work together on this. And so once they've gone through that process, the county would then be with their perhaps redesigned program, remarketing those funds, working with all their partners to get a list of projects that are going to be the obligation for using the rest of that program income that they have on hand. And that might include, they may have projected, okay, this is going to take us, we've got $450,000 on hand, but we're generally seeing every month, we're seeing an average of a certain amount of dollars. So we might want to, as part of that projection, be looking at, what our total is going to be, not only the present program income, but any we see being generated over that period. Keep in mind, as Onye was talking about in some detail, if we have program income that's generated in a federal fiscal year that exceeds $250,000, then we still also need to meet that 25% set aside requirement. And so as part of our planning, as part of our program design and making sure in our marketing to those other partners, that folks understand what rules apply and that that's taken into account as we're trying to determine eligible projects, being able to meet all of the requirements that will apply to the use of those funds. And then our third scenario is simply transferring our program income to CDBG. So in this case, when Sunshine City kind of went through that evaluation, they determined that they really didn't think, kind of tapped out on being able to find eligible NSP properties to be able to utilize that program income for. And so in this case, they've reached the decision that they want to transfer those funds to their CDBG program. And I know when I was running CDBG programs, we never had enough money for the needs that had been identified. So, I worked at the state level. We generally had competitive programs. And so we had more demand of qualified projects, then we had funds to be able to do that. So it may be a quick solution in those cases. For instance, let's say you're running an infrastructure program and you have, I don't know, $5 million in eligible applications, but you only have $3 million in your current action plan to be able to fund those much needed projects. Being able to transfer NSP program income to your CDBG program and maybe target it to your infrastructure program could be not only a quick way for you to be able to address those unmet needs that you're seeing in your regular CDBG program, but it also would be a quick use and spending down that program income balance that's being transferred. So as part of that process, again, it's doing that analysis of, what do we know about our CDBG program? What's the unmet need? What's the capacity of not only our program staff itself, but maybe subrecipients to be able to implement additional funds? And so in this case, in this example, the city determined that they'd really be better off to be able to fold the NSP program income into their existing CDBG program and target it towards that unmet need. And so the city would then go through the process that Onye was referencing of transferring that remaining NSP program income to their CDBG program, and then either incorporating that into existing programs that they already had, or it could be that you were, adding additional activities under your CDBG program that, perhaps you had not been able to fund in the past. So keep in mind that once that NSP program income has been transferred to the CDBG program, it's now going to essentially lose its identity as NSP and will need to follow all of the CDBG requirements. So, thinking in terms of an eligible national objective, an eligible activity under CDBG. So that flexibility that you had under NSP program income to be able to go up to 120% area median income and who you were serving, some of the restrictions that we had on the way that NSP program income could be used, those have fallen away at the point that you transfer it to the CDBG program, and this simply becomes additional CDBG program income that will need to be implemented following all of the CDBG regulations on that. And then our fourth scenario, and I do know of at least one state that is in this scenario that they have looked at this. In the case I'm thinking of, they actually set up a revolving loan fund specifically with their NSP program income. And so they're continuing to fund activities following all the NSP requirements. And that's something that they see a continued need for and want to keep their NSP funds available for them. So they are able to close out NSP itself, but be able to keep their program income balance and continue then to market and expend these following the NSP requirements. And so in this case, the state is simply going to close out their NSP program once that line of credit has been fully expended and those activities have met a national objective. And then they will continue to be using those funds, marketing them, ensuring that they are going to meet all of the NSP requirements. And again, this reminder that based on the rules that Onye went over about the level of funding that's being received, keeping in mind that that grantee is still going to have to make sure that not only they meet the broader NSP program requirements, but they also need to make sure that that they're meeting that 25% set aside so that they're serving households at 50% or below of area median income. So, part of their ongoing funding strategy using their program income would have to continue to vet those projects and make sure they were making commitments to projects in adequate numbers so that they were going to remain in compliance with that 25% set aside for that. All right, so we wanted to take a look at some of the tools and resources before we go into our question and answer mode. So I wanted to pull up, the good news is as of today, the program income guide was published. And there we go. And so this webinar is based on the program income guide, which simply will walk you through the strategies that Onye and I have been discussing as part of this, the things that you would need to consider as part of that sort of comprehensive approach to looking at your community needs, both for NSP and perhaps for CDBG, and making a determination on what's the best strategy for you as a community to be able to not only close out your NSP program, but also to make the best use of the remaining NSP program income that you may have on hand. And so this guide, I think, will be a useful companion for this webinar. It'll walk you through the materials that we've covered today, kind of talking through each of the scenarios that we've talked about and the requirements that relate to that. One of the things that both Onye and I talked about was, trying to figure out, okay, what's our actual level of program income that we have on hand? Some of you may have sub-grantees that were allowed to retain program income at that level. So keep in mind that when we're looking at total NSP program income, it would include not only program income that's held at the grantee level, but would also include that might be held by a sub-grantee or sub-recipient, as we might be calling them. Making sure that all program income had been receipted, and then looking at what funds have been drawn, what program income has at this point been obligated for projects, but simply has yet to be drawn, to get to that calculation of this is the amount of program income that we have on hand that's not yet obligated for a project, as part of determining if we're going to ramp up our program, if we're going to work on spending down just program income, if we're thinking about transferring our NSP program income to the CDBG program. We need to know what are those numbers to be able to go through that process then on a strategy for that. This guide also includes a NSP program income checklist, and this really walks you through the process of looking at your readiness for closeout related to program income. So looking to see, are my projects completed? Have they met the appropriate requirements on this? Do I have the documentation in place? But also thinking about, as we've been talking about, the set aside, the 25% set aside for households at 50% or below. So I think this checklist will also help you kind of go back through thinking about the status of your projects, the status of the documentation that needs to be in place to be prepared for closeout. So I'd recommend that you take a look at that after this webinar and see whether that might be helpful for you. Let me just go back to the slides here. And then also the NSP closeout process and guidance. And I think Taylor referenced the earlier webinar that was completed. So this provides additional guidance, thinking through things like compliance with that 25% set aside that you've heard us talking quite a bit about. Also relating to, for those of you that have land banks and are still working on making sure that you have either expended those funds or you have a plan for completing land bank activities, bringing them to meeting a national objective, we're talking today about program income, but also this link will provide some guidance about your quarterly performance reporting, the disaster recovery grant reporting, DRGR reporting that would be important for you. And then just kind of a list of other resources we want to make sure folks are eligible for. So the closeout notice, CPD 22-14, provides the instructions for the closeout requirements for the Community Development Block Grant program. And then the notice of changes to the NSP closeout requirements related to program income. There was an amendment, which we want you to know for the link on that. We also have a separate link on the quarterly performance requirements. As I mentioned, the NSP closeout guide. There is a closeout process and guidance page, which may be useful for you. And then for available reports, there's a closeout status report that's available at this link, and then also the monthly financial update report. So if you're not familiar with these links, these may be resources that will be helpful for you as you move forward. Lastly, I wanted to mention that we still have direct technical assistance that can be available for you. So you as an NSP grantee that are having, challenged by getting your your program closed out, being able to, go through the strategy perhaps on, making a decision about where I'm going to use my funds, program income. Am I going to keep it in the NSP program? Am I going to transfer it to CDBG? Any of these issues that are keeping you from being able to complete this process and close out the NSP program, you can request on-call technical assistance, and a TA provider would be assigned to work with you and your community. So for grantees to be able to submit that request, we've provided a link that will take you to the link on the HUD Exchange to be able to submit that request. And that may be just the assistance that some communities may need to be able to get over that hump. So with that, I'm going to hand things over to Jamie Abbott, and she's going to take us into the question and answers, which she's been handling as we've been talking. Jamie?
Hello. We have been getting some excellent questions coming through the Q&A box. And if you still have any lingering questions, please go ahead and enter your question into the Q&A box, and we'll hopefully get to them during this live session. If we do not get to your question, as a reminder, there is a office hours that will be held this Thursday, and we will make sure to answer those said questions during that time. So the first question that we're going to address is regarding the program income, the $25,000 per year. The question was around, is this calendar year? And this is an excellent question. It's my understanding that the 25,000 or the threshold is actually per the federal fiscal year, which runs October 1 through September 30th. Oh, we got Duncan that is on video. Is this a correct statement?
Yeah, it's per program year. So whatever the
Okay.
grantee's program year is, that's basically the year in which you would regard the $25,000 threshold for program income.
Okay, perfect. And this is why we have Duncan, who is part of the HUD leadership. And so that is per grantees program year. Thank you for that clarification.
And Jamie, I was just going to add, I think this is another area where folks may want to do a little bit of forecasting and thinking about what am I expecting to see coming in? So which category do I expect myself to be in? And, you could have a surprise close to the end of that program year where it changes where you end up.
Thank you, Les. All right, so the next question, are we to treat program income separate per program, for example, NSP 1 and 3, or combine them? We have program income in both 1 and 3. So NSP 1 and NSP 3 both had different regulations and requirements, and therefore we'll need to treat the program income separate per program. Duncan, do you have anything to add to that information?
Yeah, so NSP, you're looking at NSP follows the CDBG regulations and statute. It's essentially NSP being a housing program built on the CDBG chassis, if you will. So within the CDBG program, you're looking at NSP, you're looking at program income on a program year basis. You may have several different grants within CDBG open at a given year. You may have a 2019 grant open, a 2020 grant open, 2021, all the way through 2023 currently open for CDBG. But we're looking at program income generated on a program year basis in CDBG. So the same that same mindset for CDBG would be the same for NSP. You're looking at program income generated, NSP program income generated over the course of a program year, not on an individual grant by grant basis. Yeah.
Thank you for that additional information. It was great items to keep in mind. Okay, so on to the next. Where can we find examples of the program income tracker and the information to request transferring program income to CDBG? So HUD, on the HUD Exchange website, a program guide was just recently published, and the links to that program income guide has been provided within the Q&A chat, and there will be an email distribution of the said program income guide distributed out later, hopefully late by the end of this week. But you could also go out to the HUD Exchange website, and within the search bar, go ahead and type in Program Income Guide, and it will bring you to the resource page. And here's a great question, Duncan. Can program income be transferred to CDBG-DR? So my first thought is that it cannot be transferred directly to CDBG-DR, but it does not preclude or prevent the grantee from funding a CDBG eligible activity within the disaster area. I mean, there's a lot of other items to consider, but it doesn't prevent one from utilizing those funds in that way. Oh, you're on mute, Duncan.
Right. Yeah, I mean, once you transfer NSP program income into your CDBG entitlement or state program, those dollars can be used for the benefit for addressing a disaster. They can be combined with CDBG-DR funds. Toward the implementation of that activity. There's nothing to prevent you from doing that. I would point the person who asked the question also to our 2017 notice about how to use CDBG funds in response to a disaster, how to use funds across the CPD spectrum from all the CPD programs in response to a disaster. So yeah, there are many ways in which to use that funding in coordination with CDBG DR money, but they can't be transferred directly to a CDBG DR grant.
It's always worth asking that question, but yeah, great information. So on to the next question. Once NSP program income is transferred to CDBG, funds limited to NSP activities or restrictions, or are they applicable to all CDBG activities and regulations? So keep in mind that once NSP program income is transferred to CDBG, it loses its NSP, requirements, meaning that once it's transferred to CDBG, it will have to meet CDBG regulations and requirements. So the biggest change would be losing that 120% AMI of the NSP program. So keep in mind, once it transfers over to CDBG, it has to meet the boundaries or the parameters of the CDBG program. Okay. Okay, so the next question states, I'm with a state grantee who has a sub-grantees. We allow sub-grantees to retain program income at the local level to be spent on NSP eligible uses. Assuming we have all the LOCS funds obligated to sub-grantees, if a sub-grantee wishes to transfer their local PI or program income to CDBG, would one subgrantee be able to draw down lock funds while another subgrantee still has remaining program income? So what comes to mind for me, Duncan, is that once program income funds, the NSP program income funds, are transferred over to CDBG, the grantee will have to follow its method of distribution that was outlined within the consolidated plan. And must follow that method of distributing those said funds, and that most likely would require a new written agreement with any of the existing subgrantees. So essentially, once the funds are transferred, the NSP funds, or those NSP program income funds, loses its ties and takes on the CDBG requirements. You have any thoughts on that, Duncan? And you are on
Yeah,
mute.
and I think what this question is getting at is state are state NSP dollars kind of regarded as a monolith, and is there no consideration given to the subrecipient agreements that a state grantee would have with various UGLUGs across its jurisdiction with regard to the use of line of credit funds and the use of program income. And those agreements, those subrecipient agreements with the UGLUGs, they would govern the use of NSP funds for that entity. I mean, HUD is not going to, when it comes to NSP and the use of those dollars, HUD is not going to be scrutinizing the draws of line of credit and draws of PI to such an extent that, subrecipient A over here, if they've got line of credit funds available to them and PI, that they have to draw down that PI, first before subrecipient B over here, who only has PI, can draw down their set of funds. So, I would, with regard to this question, I would instruct the state to look to those subrecipient agreements first. Clearly, a subrecipient should be, if they have line of credit funds obligated to them, they should be drawing down PI before that line of credit.
Great, thank you. With that, we are all out of time for answering questions. I'm going to hand it off to Taylor.
Thanks, Jamie. Really appreciate that. If you can go to the next slide. Yep, so as you all, we kind of mentioned earlier, we do have some upcoming trainings. So on July 20th, that is going to be our NSP program income office hour session. That'll be 60 minutes set aside for you all to ask any question that you have around program income. Perhaps that is about your program specifically, or you come up with new questions that you weren't able to ask today. We will just have, it's basically a full 60 minutes of us answering your questions. Outside of program income, the next topic on this NSP series will be NSP Land Bank Closeout. That webinar will happen on July 25th. And then we'll also have a office hour session that goes with that topic on July 27th. If you do need to get in contact with us about Neighborhood Stabilization Program, you can find us on the HUD Exchange under the NSP program page. You can also contact your CPD representative. We really do encourage you to contact your CPD representative, or you can email us at nsp-questions@hud.gov. And that concludes the webinar for today. Thank you for attending. Thank you for asking your questions. We hope to see you on the 20th, where we can talk about more program income questions. And we hope to also see you on the Land Bank series. So thank you, and we hope you have a great day.